Welcome back to CrossTalk, a cross-table discussion about cross-type topics. I am, of course, Sam O'Banian. This is Nick Pannone, and we are in the thick of it. We are in Galatians 2 today. Yeah. We've already breezed through Galatians 1.
Yeah. We have. Really, it's kind of a continuation of Galatians 1.
It really is.
Yeah.
It just kind of flows naturally into what Paul's talking about.
It does, versus what we are going to talk about next week.
Yeah. a little bit.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. It'll be good. So, I almost said Ephesians. Galatians 2, 1 through 10, and I'll read this week.
I would love for you to.
Because I remember I made you read last week.
That's right. I think you got a couple chapters to catch up here.
I do.
It's all good. Right. Go for it.
Hey, Galatians 2, 1 through 10. I'll bring it over closer to the mic so I don't have to look away.
There you go.
Then, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation, and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they go to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do.
Yeah, good deal. Narrative. More
very narrative. Very like diary almost, diary-esque.
Okay, so confession here. This is some of my favorite types of scripture that we read. Genre, I guess. Mm-hmm. I love narrative portions. They don't preach well. Like this doesn't preach well.
You can't just take something out of this and...
It's not homiletic.
No.
You have to do some work in order to present that, which makes this a little dangerous.
Yeah.
a little interesting. I don't want to bore our listeners at all.
If you're reading this, I am impressed.
Yeah, I am too. Maybe they have closed captioning or something. I have no idea.
Have you seen YouTube closed captioning? It's
I have not, but following us with closed captioning might not be awesome either. Maybe it's something we can do. Anyway, I don't want to lose them when we talk about this, but there's some very, I don't want to say technical, but there's a lot of wrinkles in here that need ironed out.
There's some, what's the good academic portions of this.
That's fair.
This is an academic portion.
We will get into some scholarship with some of this, and you have to connect the dots here, right? It's really easy for us to look at this and just accept it at face value, and I'm not against that, but that's not what we're doing.
Yeah,
it's not what we're doing at all. All right, so we mentioned earlier he's continuing an argument that he started in chapter 1.
Yes.
Now, the argument he has been making is that he is an apostle.
Yeah, kind of heading 1, I'm an apostle. 2 or 1A, you don't need to be circumcised.
Right. Well, and he gets into some type of an opponent in here. He slips that in there.
Yeah, he does.
And we even have our first use of the word circumcised.
Yeah.
In here. Okay, so I was thinking about this. All right, let's paint the picture a little bit. You are part of this thing called the church, right? We hardly understand this in 2020. But this is sometime in the early to mid-30s. Mm-hmm. I mean, not 1930s or anything like that, like 30s.
Yeah.
30s. Okay? Like, this is just like 30 some odd years after year 180.
Yeah.
All right. And you're trying to figure all this out. You don't have the script in front of you. You have what the eyewitness accounts are. So you have these guys that in this text were called the pillars, right? Mm-hmm. The Peters and the Jameses and the Jameses and the Jameses, Johns.
Yeah.
I mean, all these guys, and you take them at their word, right? And then at some point in all of this, some guy that you only know, if you know him, mm-hmm. stood over the death of one of your guys that you followed, one of these pillars. he was taking letters and pulling men and women out of their homes and throwing them into jail. All of a sudden shows up and says, this is what the gospel is. All right, so you just paint that picture for a second, and you sort of understand why the church might struggle with Paul and his authority.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, I mean, when you hear of like people on death row accepting Jesus, it's like, that's great.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I came to know him because I was walking on the street, the clouds parted, and over the trees come the voice of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I had this vision and revelation, and the Lord said to me, here you go.
Yeah.
I don't want that to be taken lightly. I guess that's why I'm bringing it up.
No, for sure.
We might take something like that as, okay, hokum, whatever, that kind of thing. But the text really does say he split the clouds, and Jesus showed up and said, hey, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
Yeah.
Also, you're going to be my minister to essentially the nations.
Yeah.
Now, our experience with Paul is much, much different than that experience with Paul is. We have history to draw on. We have other sources to draw on.
We had like complete works.
The works, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's really been tested and approved over and over and over. It's been through the fire, essentially. And so I don't want us to lose that. So I bring all this up to say that this is typically flyover scripture in the New Testament. That because it doesn't preach well, because it's not homiletic.
Yeah, and we have it elsewhere almost, like parts of it at least.
Six places.
Yeah.
Right. 6 places in the New Testament we have the story, but it needs to fit. The dots need to be connected. We need to make sense of it. Again, if it's not historical, it's not really worth our faith and trust. And then we've got some cracks here that's too easy to slip through. So, in other words, if you're watching this, I think this is still worth your time to examine a text like this.
Yeah.
All right. So let's just review his argument here. The argument is that Paul has apostolic authority because he came to faith not from human origin, but from divine origin.
Yep.
That way back in verse 10, that his goal was not to please people. Why was it not to please people? Because Jesus is the one that converted him. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. Just so we know, okay, because we're going to get into Paul's story here with it. But the argument then is that he had this drastic conversion because of divine intervention. His conversion was due to that. That's in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 1. 13 through 17, he talks about the details of his Damascus Road conversion, which can be found in Acts 9 originally. And in 18 through 24 of Galatians chapter 1, there was no immediate consultation with anybody. It was essentially he and Jesus.
Yeah.
He and the Holy Spirit.
In Arabia and then Damascus again.
Arabia, yeah.
Cilicia.
In all of that.
Immediately itinerant.
Immediately, exactly. Okay, so just so we know what kind of guy we're talking about what this looks like. Paul, who was Saul originally, so Saul, his Hebrew name, okay?
Yep.
Paulos is his Greek name. Many people believe that he just went by Paul after his conversion, but he was probably going by Paul in different spaces of his life before that. We just refer to him as Paul after that because as we read in the text, he becomes a minister to the Greeks or minister to the Gentiles. All right, so this is his way of doing that. All right, in Acts 1 through 8 is our first experience with him. Acts 8, 1 through 3. Okay, Acts 8, 1 through 3. Listen, this is the type of guy we're talking about. All right? And Saul approved of his execution, talking about Stephen, which is before that the longest sermon in the New Testament.
Yep.
It's a long one. All right. And there arose on that day that they executed Stephen a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. That means they hung out in Jerusalem. They were still there at headquarters.
Yeah.
All right. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. They mourned him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Then we have a bunch of things that happen. Okay, so this is what our interpolation right here, right?
Yep.
Our bookends thing going on. Then you go to chapter 9, and here's Saul again. This is Philip is gone, the rest of 8 gone and preached in different places in Samaria and encounters the Ethiopian eunuch. Then we get to 9. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, and he asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that means if they were Christian, okay, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And then the beginning of his testimony. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And then we read the conversion that we have already read in chapter 1. Okay, I wanted to read that because this is Paul's story. This is Paul's narrative, and it is his defense of his apostleship and his authority. All right. Let's get a real brief. This is, if you want real deep, heavy stuff about Paul, this is volume 2 of a guy named Eckhard Schnabel, my favorite name. Considered right now the authority on Paul. Okay, this is volume 2.
Eckhard.
Yeah, Eckhard. That's Eckhard J. Schnabel. Okay, check it out, especially the beginning of the second volume, and you get all kinds of things on Paul. I'm going to give you the really
Cliff Notes.
not even Cliff. It's Cliff Notes of the Reader's Digest is
Yeah.
what it is. All right. So he's born in Tarsus. We know this. Tarsus is in Cilicia, which is sometimes that's Galatia, sometimes that's not,
Yeah.
depending on what time in history. We know that he was a Tarsian citizen, but we also know later on that he's a Roman citizen. Okay, you get your Roman citizenship a number of ways, as either as depending on who's the emperor and how the whole Roman Empire shapes. The most common way you become a Roman citizen is you're born a Roman citizen. You're born by someone who is a Roman citizen. At one point, you could purchase your citizenship. If you were a wealthy Gentile, for instance, or if you're a wealthy barbarian or Scythian or whatever it is, you could purchase it. However, it was technically illegal to purchase during Augustus being an emperor. However, follow the money all the time.
Yeah.
Okay? Money creates loopholes everywhere. Another really popular way to get your Roman citizenship was a way called manumission. Okay, manumission is the English version of this. It's essentially you're a slave, and the owner purchases your freedom for you.
Gotcha.
Purchases it,
Yeah.
gives it to you. And this would typically happen after 25 years of service. Jerome, the ancient church father Jerome, actually cites evidence that Paul's dad, this is how he got his Roman citizenship.
Oh, wow.
So if that's the case, then Paul could have been born into it. Potentially, depending on when it was purchased.
Paul call his father a Pharisee, though? Doesn't he say he's a Pharisee of a Pharisee?
Yes, and we'll talk about that here
Okay.
in just a second.
Good.
The other way you can do it is through military service. You could opt into the military, again, depending on who's emperor at the time and sort of how you interpret the rules and the laws. You serve in the military for 20 or 25 years, something-ish like that. Or maybe you have a major battle or you participate, earn favor.
It's like your Bronze Star, you get a...
Kind of. Maybe you have a
citizenship.
Purple Heart.
Yeah.
Something.
I can't stop thinking about, like, I was a slave for 25 years and all I got was this stupid citizenship.
Exactly. But it protected you. Roman citizenship was important because it protected you from capital punishment,
Oh, yeah.
which is when Paul reveals his Roman citizenship to protect him from an unwarranted capital punishment.
Yeah.
The punitive parts of some of the laws. Okay. He calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews, Pharisee of Pharisees. This is in Philippians 3. All right. We know that he was a Jew that probably was educated in Jerusalem. His dad would probably, I would say, Pharisee. At least it was in line with the theology of a Pharisee. Now we think of Pharisees in very negative terms. That's not quite fair.
Yeah.
All the time. The Pharisee was just a class of how you interpreted the law.
Had Jesus not truly been the Son of God, they would have been in the right
Correct.
to have not liked him.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. They adhered to the law very much.
Yes.
All right. Okay. But the fact that he moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem to be educated kind of tells us that he was sort of well-to-do. All right, so kind of high society there. And then we read, of course, that he was persecutor of the church. Now, that is a very, very abbreviated version. We could deep dive all of that if we really wanted to. But this is what we're talking about, and this is why it's important that he's sharing this story. Because it's that guy, the persecutor of the church, the Pharisee of Pharisees, the guy who can claim Roman citizenship and Tarsian citizenship, born of a Hebrew, is now saying, you don't have to be Jewish. Like, they get this Judaizing thing out of here. That's the claim he's making, okay? Somewhere along the line, someone slipped in and said, hey, this gospel that Paul's preaching is good. It's mostly true, but he didn't tell you the whole thing, right? And so we can get into how he handles all that as we break this down. Okay. That's my spiel on this. I just felt like that was really important. If you're interested in more Paul stuff, that's material galore. So go for it. Let's break this down.
Yeah, for
All
sure.
right. 2-1. We run into some things right away.
Yeah. After 14 years.
After 14 years. I just thumped that mic. Sorry about that. After 14 years. Okay. His previous trip to Jerusalem, which is mentioned in chapter 1, we were told that he remained with Peter for 15 days. Okay, it ends up back up near Damascus. Things like this. Then we're told another trip that he goes after 14 years. All right. You are a northern Galatian guy. Okay, so which probably means that you interpret this as 14 years since his last trip.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a Southern Galatian guy, which means I think that this letter was written to the churches in South Galatia in the cities that Paul and Barnabas visited on their first mission trip. Okay, that means I think that this would be 14 years from his conversion. In other words, he tells his conversion in chapter 1. Then he says, then after 3 years, then after 14 years.
Oh, okay.
All right. So how that breaks down. I'm saying that for posterity's sake so that you and I can connect the dots in our arguments.
Yeah, no, that makes that. I was very interested to see how that worked out because to me that I did read it straight as like 3 like.
There you go.
Yeah, I need to do this. This isn't even for anybody else.
Yeah.
So you think conversion? 3 years, 14 years.
That's how I would interpret that.
And then I think it's 3 and then 14.
So you would place this trip to Jerusalem somewhere around 50 AD. Okay, give or take. 49, 50 AD.
Yeah.
Maybe slightly earlier. I'm placing it somewhere between 44 and 46. Okay. Because I would say that Paul's conversion happened somewhat shortly after Jesus' ascension. All right. That said, it changes nothing with how the text is to be understood. I might also, if we were to deep dive this and argue really, really hard on this, I might say, okay, well, Paul just doesn't mention all of his trips to Jerusalem.
Yeah,
he's highlighting them.
In which I kind of make that argument in the first video with North Galatian in that we can't know all of his travels because he even mentions going to Arabia. And it's like, well, where's that in Acts? We don't really see that. So.
Both of these arguments are from silence.
Yeah.
And your argument is from continuity, and mine is from linguistics. All right. That said, he mentions Barnabas. He also mentions Titus here. We do know that Barnabas was with Paul on his first mission trip, which they did go to the southern cities of Galatia. That's in Acts 13 and 14. That he was with Paul when or at least a strong associate of Paul, when they went to Jerusalem in Acts 15. This is where the Jerusalem Council was, which is potentially what this meeting is referring to, this trip is referring to. We also know that there was a sharp disagreement with Barnabas right after this council in Acts 15 over the issue of Mark, John Mark. Right? Paul was frustrated with him because he didn't, more or less challenging his commitment.
Yeah, didn't follow through.
Barnabas says, hey, it's okay. This guy's still worth it. They parted ways. They went separate. We do know that there was reconciliation later on.
Yeah.
All right. That's kind of the timeline that we're talking about here. Okay. Titus, we talked about earlier. Titus was a Gentile, as we read in here, was Greek. We do know that Titus ultimately served the church in Crete, which is not really friendly to Jews. Someone says the Las Vegas of the first century. Okay. take that for whatever it's worth. But Titus is a major player in this portion of the story in Paul's defense.
Yeah.
Okay. That's verse 1. Do you have anything else in there?
No, I'm going to look something up quickly while you keep talking.
Okay. Are you good if I go to 2?
I would love it if you go
All
to
right.
2, because I had a thought, and if I'm wrong, then it's bad, but if I'm right, then it's cool. So keep going.
Very good. So Paul says in verse 2 here, I went up. Now listen, this is really important because he's actually going south. Anytime Jerusalem is mentioned,
You're going up to
It
Jerusalem.
doesn't matter which direction you're going, and it really doesn't matter if Jerusalem's elevated geographically or not. You are going up to Jerusalem. So from Syrian Antioch, we should put our map back up here. From Syrian Antioch, which is typically the Gentile capital headquarters for the church, you go up to Jerusalem. So
Yeah.
I went up to Jerusalem because of a revelation and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain.
Yeah.
All right. Before we break that down, you look like you discovered something.
I didn't.
Okay.
I was thinking, does the older word that we use, Cretan, a direct descendant of the idea of being from Crete, because it's such a slummy kind of place? Like, you're a Cretan, you're lowly and kind of gross because you're from this. It actually comes from a Latin word, Christianus, which is basically human being.
There you go. There you go.
So it's basically, when you call somebody a Cretan, you're just saying, you're such a person.
Good times.
So it equaled nothing.
Nice. Okay, so we run into a little bit of issue with my argument.
Yeah.
In verse 2. Okay, so he said that right after the beginning, I went up because of a revelation.
Yeah.
All right. When you look in the Acts account, especially in chapter 15, okay, Paul and Barnabas receive here's a report of what's going on. You need to go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
You need to talk to these guys. There needs to finally be some kind of meeting about this. All right. So it looks like he is being summoned there. Okay. Here's how we work around this. All right. And I don't think it's a major thing. It's an interesting thing. In Acts 11, there's a guy named Agabus who meets Paul and Barnabas in Syria, and he prophesies a bunch of things that are going on, and really the need for help in the Jerusalem church. Okay. That could potentially be the revelation that Paul and Barnabas had to ultimately wind up back in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how we would work around that. All right. They were told when he got there that he didn't preach, but he communicated, right? That I went up because of revelation set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. Uses the word anathema when he's talking about the communication there.
Yeah.
Where typically he would, when he's talking about the gospel, he uses the word euangelion in his preaching.
Yeah.
Or even caruso in the preaching. So this tells us they're not. It's not a question of salvation right now. Okay, for them. Then they had a private conversation. Only time this conversation is recorded right here, or any elements of this conversation is recorded.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything about that?
Not about that specifically.
Okay. Acts 15 is a public debate.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So if this were to happen, and at the Jerusalem Council that I think we're trying to make the case for, then it would have to either be before or after this was decided, right? That this private conversation. However, this does demonstrate that Paul does respect these pillars or these leaders. Okay. Now, he has gone out of his way so many times to say this is not of human origin. This is not. I'm not answering to man.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's an appropriate attitude that we can have. We can still respect leaders without hanging on every single word.
There's your sermon.
There's
your sermon for the narrative.
That has to be it,
Yeah.
right? That has to be it. So
yeah.
one person I read said leaders need to be respected, not venerated. Yeah. We can respect a leader without building a statue for them.
Yeah.
Okay, without idolizing them, which I think is really, really important that we do, particularly in the church, particularly today.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Then, okay, so here's the challenge here. Paul gives us a challenge in verse 2, and I promise we will move through this a little quicker, but there's muddy things right here. Okay, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. And here he says, this is the reason why I did this. In order to make sure I was not running nor had run in vain. Was that potentially something he was doing? Was preaching this gospel in vain?
When I read this, my first thought was Paul's checking to make sure he was preaching. Like, correct. Like, do I need to be preaching the circumcision correctly, or that aspect of the am I doing this? Have I been preaching in vain because I've been preaching incorrect gospel?
Okay, so if that's true, then we run into a problem. Back in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 10.
Yeah.
Am I pleasing men? Like, do I need their approval to preach this gospel that I received from above them? Mm-hmm. That presents a problem here.
Yeah.
So what's this vanity that he's talking about? How could he possibly be preaching in vain if he is preaching exactly what he has received from God? I think there's only one way around it. Okay. I think I don't think this is him doubting the gospel that he's preaching. I think this is him potentially hitting a pragmatic issue. The problems arise if he is alone in preaching this gospel. Right? How is it possible for him to preach this gospel of freedom, which he claims that he received directly from Jesus, if the church and the original 12, plus some, are preaching something different? How do we go head to head with this? Right? How do we differ? Like how do we? That's a split over a major thing.
Yeah.
Okay, this isn't color of carpets issue. This is a split over a major thing. So I think it's more pragmatic. Am I just doing this in vain? Am I just swinging in the air without any support? Right? Do we have to go revisit all these places and redo? Are they just going to redo everything?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We discover in verse 3 that it wasn't in vain.
Yeah.
All right.
But even Titus,
who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was Greek. Our first use of the word circumcise. Paratemno.
Yeah, such a fun word.
I'm going to let you have at it, man.
I was just gonna say I'm trying to find it so quickly because Perry.
One of the most popular.
Where is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Perry means around.
Around, about,
And
or in relation to.
the other word, temno, means to cut.
Yep.
So it's literally to cut around.
To cut around.
Such a good word.
We could just stop right there.
Such a good word to describe.
To cut around or to cut about.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Such a good word.
So he introduces that to us. Okay.
Sometimes Greek's really easy. There is a whole argument that a whole thing of a non-Christian saying, well, like you can't know how to translate ancient Greek sometimes because it can be flexible. And this is just such a good example of, no, sometimes ancient Greek's real easy.
I would suggest it's actually easier than English is.
Yeah.
But, okay, so circumcised. So let's talk about circumcision for just a minute because we're going to talk a lot about it as we go through this study. If you don't know, we read this, what's it doing here? Why is it such a big deal? Because it's really not an issue today. Well, this is the reason why it's not an issue today.
Yeah.
All right, this is where we find this. We can actually draw parallels to this, though. Right? All right. It was a big deal when you're talking about relationship with God. Okay, so it was a sign of God's people. This goes all the way back to Genesis 17. That you recognize who is part of the fold of God and who isn't based on circumcision.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, that seems weird, right? Well, are we just checking everybody here? I mean, and the answer is yeah.
Yeah.
It really is. You move that into the first century where Paul's writing, it's impossible not to know. There's so many places that clothing is not like it is now.
Yeah.
We are very private people, and we actually get disgusted about the lack of privacy. That's not the case then. Very exposed people.
Yeah. Privacy wasn't so much an issue.
Gymnasium.
Yeah.
The place of the naked man.
Yep.
Okay? That's the translation of it.
Yes.
Okay.
Greek's fun.
There you go. Exactly. Greek's fun. It's also a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. I always joke around about this. how come Adam and Eve get gardens and Noah gets rainbows, I get circumcision, right? So he's like, I feel like never mind. There's
Move on,
there's another
Nick.
one. Okay. From that point on, it was supposed to be done to Jewish males that were born on the 8th day after they were born, and that's when they received their name. Okay. So it's very much a sign, very much a part of the law and the cleansing law. Okay. It proselyte, one who would come to convert to Judaism would receive this this act even later on as an adult.
Yeah, it's a deeply symbolic faith symbol for the Jewish people.
Correct.
It's a river runs deep situation. It's very important.
Correct. In these private meetings, I got to imagine that all sides of the argument was looked at. Okay, so we are in verse 3 saying that even Titus, who was with me, so he was involved in the meetings, right? He wasn't convinced or forced to be circumcised. So if this was required, if the law was required, then Titus would have had to be circumcised, but he wasn't. Now, when I looked this up, I don't know if you looked anything up on this, so many comparisons between Titus and Timothy, where Timothy was required, actually opted in for circumcision. If you look this up on your own, don't get caught up in that. It's such a dumb parallel and comparison. Timothy had a Jewish parent. Okay, so he was essentially half Jew, and parts of what he was doing had severe Jewish influence.
Yeah.
So they did that as a way of not making it an issue.
It's kind of being all things to all people. Like, this will give you an in.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Right. That it was not Paul acquiescing
Nice.
to the law. He wasn't giving into this. He was, for Timothy, it was part of who he was anyway. Right. That he was Jewish.
Yeah.
And for Titus, he wasn't. He wasn't at all. So I'm not going to be Jew to be Christian, to be part of the way. Yeah. All right. Verse 4, just kind of plugging along here. Yet, because of false breath, this is where Paul starts to swing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And keep going.
All right. Let me just read this verse, okay? Just listen to the word usage he has for these folks, all right? Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. Heavy-handed. I think this is his first swing at them.
Yeah.
Okay, so first swing. Go ahead.
So this is interesting, I thought, personally. There's 3 theories about why Paul went to Jerusalem. And so the first one is just straightforward. He had a revelation. He wanted to go talk about this circumcision thing. And so they call it an anakaluthon, which is Greek for not following. So basically, he goes down around, Paul digresses. He's like, so I went to Jerusalem for a revelation, and Titus was with me, and not even he got circumcised. And then there was these brothers, or these like spies that were there, and the false brothers and all this. So that's the first theory of what's going on here. Another one is that there is a double parenthesis in here. So 3 and 5 is parenthetical versus 3 and 5 are parenthetical, and 4 and 5 is a parentheses within a parentheses.
Yes.
So that's number 2. One that I found that I really liked was that this is actually, there's 2 reasons that Paul traveled. The first is because of a revelation, and the second is because of these false brothers. And it's explained by saying that there's 2 prepositional phrases in verses 1 through 5. The first is de kata apokalupsin, which is in verse 2, and de diatus pares actus pseudodadelufus.
False brothers.
Yes, the false brothers, which is verse 4. And these link to the first verb in verse 2, or the first word in verse 2, which is anabane. And so this argument was these 2 prepositional phrases, usually prepositional phrases connect to something or each other or a verb or something like that. These 2, what argument was, connect to that verb, which means it's 2 reasons why he traveled to Jerusalem. And so then, indulge me for a second, then it reads like this. Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me, and then kind of like reason number one. And I went up by revelation and laid before them, but privately before those who were of repute, the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles, to make sure I'm not running in vain, parentheses, but even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled. And then they translate it. And it is also true that I went up, kind of added that in, because of the false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom and submit us to slavery. Which I just thought was like, because when I read this, I thought this just seems like such a mismatch. I was in the Anocaluthan of it all. I was like, why is Paul just is like, here, and then digression, and then digression, and then parentheses, and then here we are again. And I found that, and I went, that is interesting. That idea of, there's two reasons. I had a revelation that I needed to go.
Right.
And also I heard that there was these false brothers.
So it makes it a little neater.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it makes it a little neater. Okay,
Which
so
helps my brain.
it needs to, though. I think that those things are important when we're doing this type of study to organize this.
But ultimately what that changes in verse 4 is instead of yet, it becomes and.
Right, which is possible, by the way.
The translation the translation of those words could happen.
Correct.
Because sometimes
Greek
can be flexible.
You're not abusing Greek. Context is everything. Yeah. Okay, so I got caught up in the word usage. All right. False brothers. Think about that. It's actually oxymoronic.
Yeah.
Okay. Pseudo-dadelphus.
Pseudo, literally false, and then adelphos, brothers.
Brothers, yeah. Also, kind of brothers, kind of not.
Yeah.
Right? They look like part of the fold, but they're not part of the fold. In other words, they have accepted that Jesus, his ministry, died on a cross, rose on the third day. They don't deny that at all. Where the pseudo steps in, and where he's talking about enslavement here, that they're saying in order to follow him, you must obey the law.
Yeah.
All right? And so to obey the law, Gentile, Galatia, you need circumcision.
Yes.
That's your first step here. That's the first act. And by the way, circumcision was a big deal because there's no coming back from that. You don't reverse that. It's a commitment, man. It is. You are committed to this. You don't waver.
Not only that, but is it safe to say that Jews were just about the only people group that did this? I mean,
and it's obvious when it happens.
And so it's not like you can go, oh, I'm not really a Jew. It's like, are you sure? Because you're the only one in here that's...
Evidence to the contrary.
Yeah.
And on top of that, by doing that, you've removed yourself from parts of society that think that's crazy.
That opens you up to a lot of Roman issues.
And
like
criticism.
Yeah, Romans protect Jews, but not always. And so if there's a Jewish problem, you're now part of that Jewish problem.
Yep, we will protect you as long as it's convenient for us. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Then he says in there, it's such a fascinating word. False brothers were such a fascinating word to me. Okay. Then he says, secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus so that they might bring us into slavery. So all the third person stuff going on here. So they slipped in, they infiltrated is the word. And then they brought in something else. They brought in that which led to enslavement or to being enslaved. And I'll talk about that here in a second. Brought in, so they're interlopers. Okay, so they bring in something that wasn't originally there or intended to be there. Infiltrators and interlopers. I read one person, I think this is how they described it, and Betts is his name. And this is such an apt thing right here. It grabbed me. Paul uses military language which turned into political metaphors. Like, that's it. Yeah. That's it. Which tells us that we're fighting on all fronts with this. Okay. He said, because of what they brought in, this was not mere matter of opinion here. This wasn't just a small minor disagreement that can be settled real easily. But what they're bringing in, the things they're attaching to the gospel, are so anti-gospel that they enslave you again. They enslave you. That's a word that we ought, or bring us into slavery, I guess is how the ESV talks about slavery. If you're into underlining or highlighting or something, you need to pay attention to that word right here. I would highly suggest doing that in your Bible. Because the last half of Galatians is all about the antithesis of that. Yeah. It is the freedom that comes with the gospel. He says that that these false brothers, this pseudo brother, brings in, my opponent essentially, brings in, is something that's going to bring you slavery. What I have brought you brings you freedom. Freedom is such a major theme. I want to give you references to just when the word's used, not not when it's talked about, just when the actual
mean-
word is used, okay? Galatians 4:22, Galatians 4:23, Galatians 4:26, Galatians 4:31, Galatians 5:1, Galatians 5:13.
And 5:1 is, for freedom Christ has set you free.
So he uses essentially 3 different ways in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a major thing. And man, if we grab onto anything of the gospel, we are free.
Yeah.
We are free. We are free. We are free. Where circumcision may not be the issue, pick one. Mm-hmm. Pick one. We don't have to bow down to a certain direction X amount of times a day. We don't have to read X amount of verses every single day. Mm-hmm. We don't have to perform so many good works every single day. Right?
Cover our head in worship.
Right. All that to bring you into the fold. Mm-hmm. We do things like this because we have the freedom to do it.
Yeah.
Praying out of freedom is vastly different than praying to get salvation. Mm-hmm. Vastly different. Doing good works out of freedom is vastly different than doing good works in order to get salvation.
Yeah.
And this is why he calls them false, and they slipped in, right? Now, you can already hear the argument from the pseudo brother here. Hey, you know that Paul guy that came and he preached this to you? That's a good message and all, sounds nice and all, but do you know that he wasn't even part of the original 12? Mm-hmm. Do you know that, man, what he's talking about is that he heard a voice of God? I mean, how many of us can say that anytime we want to?
I think of the snake in the garden. He doesn't say God's wrong. He says, did God really say this?
Really say this?
Did Paul really say that you didn't have to do this part of it?
Exactly. And he preached to you about freedom. Yeah, that's all well and good, but do you really want to have salvation? Mm-hmm. Well, you can believe on that message, but you need to go have a procedure here.
Yeah.
Why don't you go do that? Okay. Hold on to that. You hold on to that because Paul gets so severe later on in later weeks that we get to discuss this. Mm-hmm. So hang on to that. He gets to 5. All right, so he's amped up right here. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment. The actual word is hour. Mm-hmm. Even for an hour. So that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. This is a very declarative statement here. Paul plants the flag in the ground. Mm-hmm. All right, he claims this now. I have one note on this. This is the hill Paul will die on.
Yeah.
His entire, not just ministry, life is staked on this.
Yeah, it's the whole idea of I'm not running in vain for this. Like, this is not pointless. I will stop at nothing.
Yeah, it's not vanity anymore.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it's the opposite of that because I'm going to look like an idiot.
Yeah, for you.
For you.
Yeah.
For you. So that you might have the gospel preserved. So that you might cling to the original love that I have brought to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of preserving the truth. Mm-hmm. What happens when the truth isn't preserved? It's not the truth anymore. So it's like I'm trying to allow the truth. Trying to allow you to understand the true truth.
Yes.
Not some falsehood of it.
Correct.
So
correct. Not something that sounds good.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Yeah. Absolutely. And you got to understand, circumcision really was appealing. Mm-hmm. It's very visual. It's very tangible. Mm-hmm. Freedom is not so tangible.
Yeah.
That's something that has to be explored. And so you can understand how that would slip in there. And it's been such a part of the tradition of those who would follow God anyway.
Yeah.
At least the one God. Okay, so we get to 6.
Yeah.
And from those who seem to be influential, what they were saying makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. Who's he talking about here? This is a big debate.
Sorry, I was reading the parentheses.
That's okay. Who would be the influential is essentially who it is.
Yeah. Connecting him from that and the pillars, I always just thought it was the 12.
I do
or
too.
Some level of that.
I subscribe to that too.
Yeah.
There was one argument made that he's talking about the influential or the ones who influenced the Galatians to buy into this pseudo gospel.
Ah, okay.
Okay. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't even connect those dots.
Right.
Because just, again, when they repeat words, you got to assume
Exactly.
they're talking about kind of the same thing. Here.
Exactly. Okay, so very interesting statement here. I don't think he was insulting them.
Yeah.
All right. I think he was demonstrating by example, again, an appropriate attitude toward leaders.
Yeah.
Respect them, don't venerate them. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, I fell in love with the word he uses here in verse 6. Those I say who seem influential added nothing to me. And before that, in the parentheses, what they were makes no difference. The word difference, right? Diaphere, okay, diaphere. It's said in the present tense. One scholar, his name is Dunn, makes the argument that Paul is actually less impressed with them after he met with them than he was before. Now, I don't think that's a good argument.
Yeah.
Just putting that out there. But he's not impressed with mankind. Celebrity culture is so foreign to Paul at this point and probably the rest of his life.
Man, you could almost make a sermon out of that.
You should.
I'm just trying to point out all the sermons that you
more homiletics,
said
right?
in the narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leaders did not change Paul's gospel,
Yeah.
right? Because you were influential, you didn't change. They weren't persuaded by someone just because they are an important person.
The truth is the truth, no matter who you are. It doesn't matter.
Correct.
Yeah.
So with that too, they didn't disagree with Paul.
Yeah.
All right. There was
on
no
the same
disagreement.
page.
I've got this in capital letters here. No disagreement or breakdown in the unity versus what the false brothers were doing. Right. So there was no breakdown. I think Paul's just saying, even if there was a disagreement with me, I wasn't persuaded by them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been persuaded by them. Okay. Now that's important for what we get to talk about next week.
For sure.
All right.
I would just want to say I was distracted because I was reading the parentheses because of the wording of it,
Yes.
which is like the first part of what sort of quality they are doesn't matter to me. That's kind of like a wooden. But the God shows no partiality is almost literally God doesn't take up a human face.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's confusing. I saw it's face the God of human does not take up.
Yeah. The Greek is really weird in
It's super weird.
It's-
And I just love that, like, trying to make that fit into
Yeah.
English. It literally, like, God shows no partiality is the best way to translate it. But it literally could be God doesn't take up a human face, or the face of God isn't man's.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Now, okay, so the other important thing to know, too, is it is possible that those influential people, the leaders, we get three of them named, Peter and John and James, brother of Jesus. It is possible that they were preaching a gospel that included Judaizing. Okay? Now, what I would say is they were preaching what they knew.
Yeah.
It actually isn't until later in Acts, or before the Jerusalem Council, when Peter has his vision about unclean animals and things like this, that he starts to realize that, oh, we're free from the law.
Yeah.
Right? But he's preaching what he knows.
Could that be part of the revelation in the gospel that Paul is putting in front of them of, like, hey, guys, like, I got this revelation that there's something different here.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And I think this is why Peter can agree to it, because he received a similar revelation. He wasn't convinced by human either.
Yeah.
From mankind either. That said, it looks like there's a slip later on. Okay. 7 and 8 I've got together because they're making one argument. He's making one argument.
Yeah.
On the contrary, this is such a pivot that Paul brings in most of his arguments. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. All right. That's actually pretty clear what he's saying. Yeah. But it's very emphatic.
Yes.
On the contrary is a very strong phrase. It's a very, very strong phrase. Okay. On the contrary, they weren't trying to break down the argument I'm making to you that I also presented to them in a private meeting. On the contrary, they agreed. They agreed. They did not establish Paul's authority, but they recognized that his authority came from the exact same place that Peter's came from.
Yeah. Yes, and I have an interesting another tidbit that I found.
Yeah.
That I found interesting. Again, you can fast forward if you don't. He uses Petros, which is weird for a couple reasons. Number one, he said Cephas
Later
not
on.
that long ago.
Yeah, and he's getting ready to say it again.
Yeah, and he says it again
In the next verse.
Cephas, and he almost always calls Peter Cephas, almost always. And so the question was, well, why has he changed to Petros? And there's two theories. Again, we're going theories. Because it's 7b and 7b, so starting with just as Peter, and
Yep.
then going all the way through 8, is different. Mm-hmm. And so the argument is, well, he used Petros in this kind of verbiage because he is quoting a division of labor document that was drafted. So basically it's called the
interesting.
protocol hypothesis.
Interesting.
Paul is taking directly from a contract made with the other disciples of, I will take care of the Gentiles if you take care of the circumcision. And so he's quoting directly, and that's why Peter would have used Peter would have used Petros as like the name that God gave, or Jesus gave him in this official document. That's argument number one. The second one is that this was added later. That
Interesting.
somebody threw this in to kind of help shore up who Peter was going to and who Paul was going to, because their argument is Paul would have, first of all, well, there's a couple reasons. One, Paul would have used the word Cephas, the name Cephas. There's a strange verb use in there. The fact that he distinguishes between two gospels, kind of, instead of, it's like the gospel to the circumcised and gospel to the uncircumcised. The argument is it'd be one gospel, no matter who's receiving it, is one of the arguments. And then the idea that he's kind of making this parallel between the two great missionaries, because the later church saw like Peter was a great missionary to the Jews and Paul was a great missionary to the uncircumcised, and Paul wouldn't have thought of himself in these terms.
Right.
And then let's see.
Interesting.
He doesn't really establish himself as or he doesn't really treat himself as an apostle in these verses. Like Peter for his apostolic ministry, and then also through mine. They say, why didn't he just say my apostolic ministry or something to that effect?
Right.
And then finally,
that's what I read.
Just kind of out of context, like it just kind of comes out of nowhere a little bit. They argue it's like it basically the argument. The last one is it seems added in. But I think the most interesting thing to me is it doesn't. If you take it out, it fits still. Like
It still fits.
on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcision, and when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to me. So it could be taken out and still work. And so those are the two arguments. Either he is quoting something directly,
Right.
because he wouldn't use these kinds of words, or even say Petros, or somebody added it later just to kind of shore up some of that argument, which some people take offense to that of, well, how could you?
I don't know that we need to take offense to it. I think the evidence is circumstantial.
Yeah.
At very best.
Yes, and I would again argue that it doesn't change the
Right.
meaning of it and its truth still.
So I would say there's actually no reason to accept an interpolation. Okay? I'm going to add a third argument here. I think Paul's making a point. I think Paul uses Peter as an argumentative testament here. First of all, he just now put his name and Peter's name together. All right? So you're seeing them together. It's very marketable.
Okay.
And what does Petros mean?
Rock.
Rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the same gospel that the rock preaches is the same one I've been entrusted to preach. We just have different audiences, which to me is so very interesting because Peter was the first one to receive a vision for the Gentiles. The first one.
Yeah.
Paul's first thing that he always did,
Was go to the synagogue.
go to the synagogue
Yeah.
and appeal to the Jews, as he was one, right? And so it's very, very similar. I think what he's trying to do is point out that the ministry to the Gentiles and ministry to the Jews is the same gospel. In other words, this whole Peter preaches the circumcised, I preach the uncircumcised. Their message really isn't be circumcised or don't be circumcised. Their message is Jesus.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're circumcised. The Jews were referred to as the circumcised often, right? Gentiles in Jewish land were referred to as uncircumcised. Yeah.
Or ethnos, yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. All the time. All the time. So I think he is saying, I was accepted in the same way Peter's accepted. His revelation, Petros, he receives that revelation the same way I received mine. Jesus told him, you are now Peter.
Yeah.
Jesus told Paul, you are now mine for the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Same way. So I think it is campaigning.
Yeah, and I don't really have the only one I don't like is the protocol, the idea that he's quoting something, because
We don't have evidence.
That's not only an argument from silence, that's an argument from silence and blindness. Like there's surely that would be in Acts somewhere.
Creativity.
Yeah, that's just making
or some kind of archaeological evidence.
That's an ex nihilo argument. Out of nothing.
Out of nothing from nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I can meet out an interpolation hypothesis because I don't think it affects the Bible that much. The only thing that's a hiccup for me is that Petros, Cephas.
Mm-hmm.
It's just because it's strange that he would go, because using Cephas before and after that, it's just interesting that he wouldn't go, yeah, Cephas. Like, that means rock too, you know what I mean? Like, anyway.
Yeah, well, again, it doesn't throw me off. That's probably the strongest part of that second argument.
Yeah.
And so I think that's okay. But he's also getting ready to criticize Cephas. And
Fair.
So to keep it in context, so I think there's a transition that's happening with that, which I think probably furthers the campaign argument here, the argumentative argument. That, okay, I'm going to call him by this to make this point, but the rock does not, let's not criticize rock. Let's criticize Peter, or criticize Cephas. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
Okay.
Still a hang up for me, but we can move on.
That's fine.
We can talk about hang ups later and not waste precious tape.
That's fine. And again, we can agree to disagree
Yeah.
on some of that stuff too. I struggle with it being an interpolation only because I don't see a reason for it to be. We just don't have it without it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we've got 2 more verses left. We get to 9. And when James and Cephas, there's your guy, and John, who seemed to be pillars, I like that.
Appeared to be.
Yeah. Perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All right.
I just as soon as I read seem to be pillars, seems like such a nice way of saying like they seem like they're like the main leaders. But it could also be read as like such an underhanded like, well, they seem to be the ones, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the actual way that we look at that is what you were told about me not being part of them. Stop.
Yeah.
Right. Stop. Yeah. God picks who's going to influence. Right. And seemingly they've been influential. It's hard to argue that.
Yeah, that's the Transfiguration crew.
But they have accepted the same grace that was given to me.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this isn't just grace of salvation. This is grace of his work, grace of his ministry. Right? Quite often, spiritual gifts are spoken of in this way. That God proportions his grace in the way he chooses. So you're going to demonstrate grace. Here's my grace to you in preaching. Here's my grace to you in teaching. Here's my grace to you in prophecy. My grace to you in tongue. All these kinds of things. Okay. Which I think is sort of a way that we need to pay attention to this. They recognized that my apostleship, my influence was from Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, they're saying the pillar, like the people who seem to be the pillars, the people that seem to be the main 3 guys, recognize my apostleship.
Correct.
Again, it's like if someone in authority recognizes your authority, that means like that probably means I have authority. Like
correct. Okay. Let's talk about the right hand.
Yeah.
They extend the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me.
Such a weird I'll say it again because I said it to you earlier. Dexias koinonias.
Yeah.
Just
koinonias is the fellowship.
Yeah, it literally is. I mean, Dexias is right hand, and koinonias is fellowship.
Yeah.
Church.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So there's so many cultural things with this.
Bang to the wall.
With my right hand, by the way. Yeah. So many cultural things going on with this. First of all, I think the idea that's being communicated here is that they extend the same authority, not just recognize it, but okay, we extend this. And fellowship is the key word here.
Yeah.
That we are doing the same work.
So that's how I read it at first. Was like because the right hand, most people are right-handed, and so it's kind of the idea of like you're the action, like you need to continue the action that our right hand is doing.
Okay,
kind of thing.
so if you were
You're
a
the right
person
hand of the church.
if you were a person of authority, now this is true then, and we still have this in our language now. Okay, if you're a person of authority and you have a right-hand man, they are operating with the same authority, not just under the same authority, but with the same authority.
Yeah.
So there's things to be taken with that. Also, the right hand, when you hear right hand, okay, so you get even the original 12 who are arguing who's going to sit at the right hand of God, right? It's a place of honor.
Yeah.
It's also a phrase of compliment, okay? Particularly then, and I think if I were to look into this more, it's probably still somewhat true in this part of the world, that when you clean yourself, you're typically doing that with the left hand. Because your right hand is the hand that does the business. So we shake hands for a deal. We write out the proposals. We speak with this. This is the hand. This is the kind of the exterior. This is the interior.
Okay.
All right. So this sort of way of thinking that. So if I were to extend my left hand to shake hands with you, there's something
Highest insult.
literally backhanded about it.
Yeah.
Okay. But if I'm right here, there's something honorable. There's an agreement that is made here. That's not just a contract, but an agreement among.
I respect
man.
you enough to
Yeah,
extend the right hand
Exactly.
and the correct hand.
Exactly. Well, and because a lot of personal cleaning is done with your left hand specifically so that you can keep this one free to do social business.
Yeah.
Okay. I think all that fits in there. I think all that.
So public business, private business.
That's yeah, exactly.
Just rattling it off. That's
well,
my sermon.
but it really is.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
it's funny.
Yeah.
But it really is to think of it that way. I think we see this as saying, okay, they recognize us as being on the same space as them.
Yeah.
Okay, being in the same ministry space as them. So Peter, John, and James saw the same gospel being proclaimed from them as they were preaching to the Jews. Okay, and being persecuted by the Jews, by the way, which we already read, and Paul was one of those.
I just remembered an argument for the 7b through 8 that I'll just mention real quick. Another argument was that it was repetitive, the gospel to the circumcised for Peter, and then he continues on in 7.
Correct.
Or in 9. But so
Correct.
I'm just gonna interlope that thought into that.
But it still fits, right?
Oh, it
because
still
it's the
does,
same
yeah.
gospel. All right, so
I'm not gonna die on that hill. Like I don't.
Right.
It doesn't bother me either way.
right. Well, they're recognizing that the same gospel is being preached, but by extending the right hand of fellowship, they're also recognizing the need for the gospel to be proclaimed to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Going, okay, and if you remember in chapter 9 of Acts, and then he says it also 2 other times in Acts, gives his testimony in Galatians, gives his testimony in 2 Timothy, and there's one other place, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. Anyway, if you remember, Jesus said he is going to be my guy for the Gentiles. Like specifically, I'm splitting the clouds for that reason.
Yeah.
To deny the gospel to the Gentiles is to deny Jesus. Right? They recognize that. They recognize the source of that. Paul's argument is solid if you're comparing him to the other 12, to the pillars.
Yeah.
Well, that means he's one. That means he's one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay. So we wrung out the argument here, all right? In 10, this is my favorite part of this
I know,
whole thing.
me
Okay.
too.
Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. This is the only mandate he was given by those that influence.
The only rule is there are no rules except one thing.
Except for this one thing, remember the poor.
Yeah.
All right. And he said, "But this is the very thing I was eager to do." What's he talking about here? Is this like a general lesson, or is he talking about something specific?
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I read one guy that argued that this was a what's the word, benevolence kind of thing, and another one was he made an argument that it was poor in spirit kind of thing, like
Interesting.
those being persecuted. Don't forget those that are low in spirit or being like attacked because
a beatitude.
Saul himself was an attacker.
Very good. I actually think that those things are way more similar than most people give credit for.
Yeah.
They're two sides of the same coin. Okay, it's the only mandate. Remember the poor. I think there's something specific here. Okay, so mind you, he's meeting with the leaders in Jerusalem, and partially because of Paul's work, before knowing Jesus, there was a dispersion. Which meant, let's say someone comes and persecutes South Rock Christian Church and we scatter. That means our resources are scattered.
Yeah, I mean, take what you can.
People are the resources.
Yeah.
Okay. Everywhere in the New Testament, we read that the church in Jerusalem was suffering. All right? So part of what Paul writes in almost all of his letters is, hey, I'm coming by to take up this collection to help out the church in Jerusalem. I think that's what this is the catalyst for it in this meeting. Hey, guys, we're suffering here. So if you go to the Gentiles and you've convinced them we are all in the same family, please remember us.
Yeah.
Please remember what's going on here. And think about James particularly, right? The leader of this church watching families be split, watching property be taken away, potentially someone in their home where either dad or mom was dragged out and they still have kids, or kids were orphaned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing the same Pharisees and Sadducees that convicted Jesus and hung him on a cross, you're seeing still in Jerusalem. Like, it's not like they're going to stop running into each other.
That high priest was one of the same high priests that were making the decisions there that Saul had appealed to.
Yeah.
So would you help us out? I am so stretched. See if they would be willing to help out, because they don't suffer in the same ways that we are suffering right now. And if the Jerusalem church is strong, we're all strong, right? Now, that aside, I think, to me, that's actually one of the craziest pieces of evidence that God and his plan for the church is real, right? No one makes up a story about helping out the religious people in Jerusalem, right? You don't invent that.
Yeah.
It's a dumb story. Jerusalem was well known for their vast wealth and resources for the religious. Okay? Jerusalem doesn't suffer at all wealth-wise.
Yeah.
Okay? They just don't. The Jews know how to save. They know how to manage. They know how to steward. It's all over the Torah. It's all over.
Yeah,
it's all
that's
over
what the law
rabbi.
is. Yeah,
It's exactly what it is. That's why they have storehouses. That's why they're able to give off the top. That's why they're able to love their neighbor, right?
Yeah.
To do these things that the law requires of them. That's why the year of Jubilee is able to happen. You take a whole year off from farming. It's able to happen. That also tells you how critical the situation was, that the leaders would say, okay, we need to do something to take care of these guys, take care of these widows, to take care of these orphaned, take care of those that are in jail, all these things. And Paul's like, I'm eager to do this. This is what I want to do.
That's the whole point.
Yeah, I don't want to have a separate church, a Gentile church and a Jewish church. I want to have a church. That's the mission I was called to.
Yeah.
And by the way, because of that, God's real.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, that to me is such an apologetic that it's hard to deny that. So, anyway, that's 1 through 10.
Yeah. That's all I got.
Yeah. So some fun stuff for next week.
Yeah. So next week is the end of 2. Next week we'll be doing Galatians 2:11 through the end, which is 21.
Yeah.
11 through 21, chapter 2 next week. As always, if you have any comments or questions, you can email me at samuelo@southrockchristian.com. He is Nick P. at southrockchristian.com. We'd love to hear from you about 2 weeks ago, last week, this week, next week, 4 weeks from now, whatever the case is. Just let us know if you have questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. So I think that's it from us. Until next time, we'll see you again.
See ya.